Sí, los niveles de gobierno. Now time for subject matter intentional logics part 2 by Thomas Ferguson. Please, Thomas.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi. All right. So I'll try and keep this under 2 hours and 7 minutes today. I'm going to keep going. Well, I guess I can look at that. Okay. Okay. So we're good. Same kinds of themes, but what I wanted to cover today was, I know that Franz was out here. Did Franz talk about topic sensitive intentional models? Yeah. Okay, so I wanted to we covered some of the basic stuff with this Perry setting yesterday. Kind of what I'm hesitant to use the word state of the art because it's only my stuff, but like that's the state of the art because the only person who did it. So with the machinery. But now I want to talk about how to apply it in 2 distinct realms. And one of those is in topic sensitive intentional modals, like how we have this machinery with this sort of intentional subject matter. How can we sort of bring it back to bear on Franz's stuff? And then I wanted to talk about how we can bring it to bear on the analysis of relevant logics proper. Because the stuff that we talked about, this containment logic, and I'll have a slide about this, it has, so are we familiar, do we know what relevant logics are? I think I mentioned it yesterday. So there's this principle with these containment logics I talked about. Can I put this up? Yes. These containment logics I talked about, I mentioned this property that something is provable in the system, an implication here, only if like the variables of C are contained in the variables of P, right? So this is not sufficient, right? But this is necessary. And this is the proscriptive principle, or PP. So Perry introduced this term because it's a proscription. What you can't have is things that appear in C that don't appear in P. But this is very, very related to this principle in relevance logic called the VSP, the variable sharing property, which is just that a condition on this is not that they are included, but that this thing is not empty, the intersection, something in here. We talked about this as well. So clearly, everything that satisfies the proscriptive principle, except in probably some weird vacuous cases, also satisfies the VSP, which means that these Perry logics are in fact relevant logics. But they're kind of the black sheep of the family is how I think about them, because they don't get developed in that sort of mainstream Anderson-Belknap American style. They don't get developed in that Australasian style with Routley and Plumwood and Meyer and Brady. They've always been kind of on the outskirts, despite the fact that that characteristic property qualifies them. It buys them admittance as a relevance logic. So there hasn't been a great deal of sort of interaction between the Perry style containment stuff and mainstream relevant logics. And one of the nice things about last year was actually going on to show that there are properties that naturally come out in this context that really do impact mainstream relevant logics. And this is stuff that I'm working on with Shay London, Roy's PhD student, or 4 PhD students, and Sean Spandever. So stuff that we're going to review and talk about. a series of papers that made up sort of yesterday, and then we're going to cover things from this paper with Shay, and we're also going to cover things that it's in preparation with Shay and Sean Sandeffer. So basic tour of what we're going to talk about. First, we're going to talk about how to apply the machinery, the topic, the sort of failure of topic transparency for intentional connectives when it comes to topic sensitive intentional modals, and then we're going to talk about how this goes back to impact mainstream knowledge. Okay, good. Again, the same will apply. Interrupt me at will, or tell me if there are questions and so forth. Okay, so this might be redundant since you just saw Franz, but Franz has introduced these topic sensitive intentional modals. They're intended to model sort of intentional operations, as I said, things like a current belief, things like knowledge relative to information, things like the logic of imaginative activity. And the way that they operate is that we have an Adams-Lewis style conditional logic, like all these counterfactual conditional kind of things, and we pair it with this content inclusion filter. So in the same way that we saw the sort of double-barreled analysis with the Perry stuff, it's truth preservation in all possible worlds, and also the content or the topic of one has to be included in the topic of the other. Very, very much harmonious with what Franz has been doing. The syntax then, or I'm sorry, the model theories, we have each of these topic sensitive intentional modals, X. We have an accessibility relation between worlds, so that it's a counterfactual, and also sometimes we can include strict conditionals and these sims where X, P, C, treat as given P, an agent will X that C. So if this is a belief thing, given input P, an agent will have grounds to believe currently that C. Given information P, an agent will have grounds to know that C. Or given an imaginative activity that is initiated by Phi, an agent will be imagining that C. And I'm sorry, C. And there will be other ones. You can cook up many other sort of intentional operators from it. Oh, yeah. So this I of P, C, when engaged in imagining a state that P holds, an agent also imagines that C. B of Phi, C, given input Phi, an agent believes C. B given input Phi suffices to constitute knowledge that C. So you can use this in a number of domains. Frequently, things are going to be doxastic or informational in tone. So like we saw yesterday, there is this sort of topic assignment, and in Franz's work, we just have one clause with assignment of topics to complex formulas. It's, I mean, still recursive, but every atom gets assigned a topic that's in this lattice of topics, and then for any complex formula, this is just a big fusion of all of the topics of P such that P appears in the atoms in P. So there's something, on the one hand, nice about this. It's very uniform. We don't have to give recursive clauses for everything. But on the other hand, the actual topic theoretic contribution that, for example, strict implication is completely sloughed off. Any topic theoretic contribution that a sim itself might make is completely disregarded. And so the truth conditions, right, we can see this is like a sim X of the C is true at a world if all of those Phi accessible worlds are such that C holds. So this is a standard sort of Lewis-Adams style condition. And also the topic of C is included in P. Good. So in the book, Franz's book, right, he does acknowledge that topic transparency seems to hold in extensional cases, but it acknowledges that it's a problem when we think about things like attitude descriptions, like things like intentional connectives and intentional operators in general. Right? Attitude descriptions, Franz writes, don't seem to be, in general, topic transparent. The proposition that Mary believes that Scotland is lovely, unlike the proposition that Scotland is lovely, is about what Mary believes. So there's a topic shift that occurs. And what you can see right here is this condition right here this feels insufficient, right? So, I mean, the consequence for this would be the topic of box of B is going to be equal to the topic of B, but that's already like in natural language, I think you can see how those things might differ. So Franz from the get-go acknowledges that this is a limitation. The question is like, what can we do to actually modify this? Yeah, so the current development of the theory of these sims, it stops short of assigning these things, and I think that that kind of hobbles the scope of their applicability, right? We clearly have. I'm sorry. Do you want to move slide? Yeah. So the thing is that there are two kinds of approaches that you see in people that write on sims stuff. So Franz and his collaborators. There's this very coarse assignment where we just say that, listen, intentional connectors don't make a difference. Intentional operators don't make a difference. It's just the fusion of all of this stuff, like those atoms. There's an approach that says, listen, for intentional stuff, we're just not going to assign it a topic whatsoever. Right. And then there's another strategy that Iboga has used on one occasion, which is just we're going to treat them as like don't cares in the Kleinian sense. We're just going to say, just give it a topic, it doesn't matter because we don't actually care about these cases. And all of these things are sort of limited. Like if we're going to be very coarse about it, then that means that we can't really apply sims to talk about beliefs. And if you want to like adopt static intentional logic, then part of our argument, like human discussion, we talk about the things that we believe, and we know that we have beliefs. These things interact. We have beliefs about intentional states. Obviously, we have beliefs about intentional statements. And so, like, if it's super coarse, we're not going to be able to respect that. Likewise, if it's just sort of empty and we don't assign them topics, then again, it feels like infelicitous. If we do it completely randomly, then there's no principled thing that's actually telling us what the topic of one of these intentional sentences is. So all of the approaches that I think that we have in print are sort of limited in, they limit the whole project that Franz is trying to get out there because it limits the scope of what can be done and what can be expressed. Now, we talked about like very fine style semantics. That was our basis for going through everything yesterday. It's the exact same structure that's used in Franz's case. The only difference is that in Franz's case, there's just one overarching topic semilattice that holds for all possible worlds, whereas with fine, every world receives its own topic semilattice. And in this Notre Dame paper, that sort of kind of thing is explored in the Perry case about like what kind of constraints follow if we start thinking about what does it mean to have just one copy of a semilattice when they all agree, like when they're isomorphic. So there's a lot of interesting extensions between PAI and other systems where we start tweaking what do we know about these individual topic semilattices. But the point here is that they're the same structure, essentially. Like, and given the fact that Berko is sort of inheriting Fein's machinery, everything that we said yesterday can be immediately ported over. There's like perfect backwards compatibility, just backwards compatibility right here. So we introduced these sort of lollipop functions that instead of just having semilattice, we had further binary functions on here. And now what we can do with any of these sim models is for one, we can add a function that assigns the topics with strict implication. So what does this mean? This means that the topic of this picture, right? It's like a Lewis style strict implication. But this thing does not need to be then the topic of phi fusion topic of C. Because, right, the topic of phi lollipop, this thing might be different, right? So we have an additional degree of freedom there. And then for each sim that we've got, we can include its own little lollipop function. And now for things like, given information, I have grounds for knowledge. These sorts of intentional connectives can have an additional function that go ahead and govern their own topic theoretic contributions. So everything that we sort of talked about in the Perry case immediately can be imported to go and apply. So so we can revise these topic assignment functions from this very coarse thing to just, again, assume extensional transparency. And again, for these purposes, assume negation transparency. But now we can assign the topics of strict implications with this lollipop. And for any one of these sims, now we have an additional device that allows us more freedom in terms of defining its topic. Various conditions then can be applied. You might think that these topic theoretic inclusion properties that hold for one type of conditional or one sim, it might be slightly different than another, right? And so what we can start doing is we can also build in constraints on the semantics to say that, listen, like us 5 strict implications, the topics of if B then C is always going to be part of the topic of if B then C. I'm sorry, if B then C fused with if C then C, right? So like we can build in semantic constraints if you feel like. Listen, one thing that I didn't say explicitly, but I think was kind of clear from some of the examples we discussed, is that different intentional connectives have their own sort of internal logic about topic theoretic inclusions. It feels very plausible to me that in case of the intuitionistic conditional, so if I've got this as the intuitionistic conditional, that the topic of this exceeds the fusion of the topics of the parts. So in the case of intuitionists, intentional connectives, I'm a kind of diehard BHK person, and I think that this is totally right. This has to hold. This is what the intentional subject matter of this is a constraint on the intentional subject matter of intuitionist conditionals. This says any proof of B, I have a function that gives me a proof of C that seems to extend. I have a proof of B and I have a proof of C. Okay. If we move on counterfactuals then. Counterfactuals. Like, I think that this is much more suspect here for reasons like that we talked about. Like the Benjamin Franklin kind of case. Like when I talk about counterfactuals, I can somehow slough off part of the topic of the parts. So I think that this can't be expected to hold in general. I think that this can be expected to hold in general. So each intentional connective seems to have its own sort of topic theoretic properties that govern how the intentional connective sort of mediates and modifies that input subject matter and creates a new subject matter therefrom. Right. So what does this mean? This means that now we have the flexibility to start encoding these things and putting them into the semantics and then also putting them into the axiomatic presentations themselves. Yeah, different interactions between sims have different logics. And you might also see this in terms of something about like belief and knowledge. So I mentioned this yesterday, but we can make it a little bit more formal. If I have a logic of sims in which I've got 2 intentional operators, I've got knowledge and I've got the current belief. If we were to take that just by true belief mythology and to take it literally and seriously, and again, in the second paper, it gets into this, and one of the referees called me out on like, well, why are you endorsing justified true belief? Nobody believes that anymore. I'm not endorsing it. I'm just saying that you can imagine a case in which these inclusions are going to be reasonable. There are certainly other ones. But what might I want to put the constraint on here if I wanted to say that I've got an operator for knowledge and I've got an operator for belief? Well, it seems that that sort of notion that belief is analytically part of knowledge is that anytime I have A, B lollipop B, that topic, whatever it assigns, has to be part of the overall topic of A lollipop with a K. Right? What does this say? This is like my belief ascriptions when it comes to this sim are always a part of the large topic theoretically. They're always a part of my larger knowledge description. That doesn't mean anything about the truth. It doesn't mean that belief entails knowledge. It doesn't mean that knowledge entails belief. This is purely on a topic theoretic line. My saying that given B is enough to have a belief that C that is implicit theoretically in an assertion that given phi, I have grounds to know that psi. It's just part of the meaning. Right? So with this sort of stuff in place, Whereas in the stock sort of sim accounts, we don't have the language to really formalize something like the JTB account. But this gives us the sort of flexibility to do it. So we can analyze this a little bit more. If we were to have a sim-like framework and we were to have these additional functions in there, we could pop in this thing that the topic of a belief description is always part of the corresponding topic of the knowledge description. And we also had this other constraint that anytime from K to C, when I can see a world through this, then, I'm sorry, there's a typo here, that should be D. Anytime I can see like a K world, I can see the corresponding B. What would that mean? That gives us a validity of knowledge of this knowledge is sufficient to yield belief, right? So we can now pair these sort of topic theoretic semantic constraints with like the truth or veridically minded semantic constraints. And this allows us to start thinking, well, I've got some positions about the interaction of knowledge and belief in the topic sensitive intentional emotional context. I wanted to think about an extension that reflects the JTB account. And now we've got all the tools needed to go ahead and make things like this true. Okay, so given information that KFP C1 is always in a position to know that you have a corresponding belief. Make sense? Yeah, and another thing that I think is kind of interesting, and I don't know beside it. So this is like, we were thinking about like the justified true belief thing. Another thing that we have this sort of additional flexibility to do is look at other epistemic principles about, for example, knowledge. So we've got this KK principle, like there's the Hintica, or I think that's where the name comes from. But in modal logic, right, sometimes you have this sort of positive introspection principle, which is if you know that B, then you know that you know that B. Is there an analogous principle that we can do that we can sort of add in something for this? One thing that we can only sort of express, one of the huge limitations that you get in all the various things is you can't convincingly nest these things. That nesting thing was kind of the important word that they didn't use. You can't, in a very nice way, start nesting these sims because the topics become completely like superfluous at that point. There's no contribution from the knowledge at all. So when we can do that, we can talk about things like having these KK principles in Franz Bertaux's logic that we can't really do without this additional sort of machining. So this reads, if B is sufficient to generate knowledge at C, then B is sufficient to generate the knowledge that it generates the knowledge at C. Right? But this is something that I think is plausible, if not correct, but irrespective of its actual like status as a truth or a falsity about epistemology, it's the kind of thing that we would like to be able to model, and we can only do it with this kind of stuff. So if we put in here something like that this relation RK B is transitive, and we have this additional thing that whenever B is a part of A, the topic of B, or the topic B is a part of A, then A lollipop B is a part of A. These are the conditions that are required to get you this sort of access. Okay. All right. So there are a lot more sort of inroads that you can make with the topic sensitive intentional modals. I just kind of wanted to survey a couple of them. There's a lot more in like the second paper in that sequence. But like, again, this was the kind of, I needed to produce something for Franz, like this is something you can use. If you are into like the topic sensitive intentional modal thing, like hopefully these kind of suggest that like this kind of machinery really sort of advances it and helps you do things you couldn't do in an initial context. Okay, so that's how this relates to sims. How does this relate to mainstream relevant logics? I'm sorry, is something clear? Okay, I mentioned some of this like 15 minutes ago. Containment logics in that parity style, right? Even if they satisfy the letter of the law for what it takes to be a relevant object, they've constantly been sort of disregarded for not satisfying the spirit of the law, right? If you read, Intensional Volume 1, Anderson and Belknap give some room for Perry-style stuff to be talked about, but don't really acknowledge it as a relevant logic. They're like, this is kind of something in our ballpark. If you read Routley and it's Routley and Meyer and
Ready.
Is it Routley and Routley at that point? If you read relevant objects in their articles, like Sylvan just takes off the gloves and comes for Perry in there. Like he's really like Perry's doing everything wrong. This is not a relevant object in the sense that I know. So they've always been kept at sort of arm's length from the traditional relevant community. But one of the things is I want to make a case, and this is the paper with Eco, as they think, and also the New Directions Relevant Logic paper, that it's not just that they satisfy these formal criteria, but they can actually help us gain some insights into the operations of mainstream relevant logics. And I think that this is like knockdown. I think that like, especially with like keeping up with Shea, I think a lot of things that become really obvious when we start thinking about this conditional agnostic stuff totally gives us a new insight into relevant objects. Okay, so I've tried to make some things kind of line up. Like we've got this variable sharing property on the one hand that's characteristic of relevant logics, and in the containment logic case or in the topic threaded case, sort of corresponds to the prescriptive principle. I wanted to say we haven't really dug into it at all, but that the strong variable sharing property, right? Recall that it's not sufficient that an atom appears in both antecedent and consequent. But still it's required that they appear with the same sign to say that there's topic overlap. So what does that mean? That means that sort of corresponds in mainstream relevant logics with the rejection of negation transparency, right? If I say that, this isn't a relevant theorem, but that this doesn't satisfy those variable sharing properties, what I'm saying is there's not topic overlap between P and not P. And what I'm then saying is that the topic of P is not equal to the topic of this. Not in virtue of it's not being provable in relevant logic, but if you're casting this out for not observing the strong variable sharing property, you're essentially again saying that negation transparency has to be. And so again, I said this yesterday, but this is implicit in every relevant logic like below R, is that negation transparency. If you give it this topic overlap reading, that this is it just rejects it out. And then depth relevance, we have this is the condition that we have with I'll get into it in slightly more detail. It's a condition that it gets originated with Ross Brady, that it's not just that the variable appears in the antecedent and consequent, that variable has to appear in the same number of nestings of intensional conditions. So in this case, when you look at depth relevance, this is the kind of thing that is going to go. This is going to go because even though you've got a variable appearing in the left-hand side and the right-hand side that's the same, there's not topic overlap. And why is that? Well, on the formally, it's because P appears in a depth 1. It's nested in an essential conditional. And on the reading, I'm really strongly pushing. What that means is that the topic theoretic contribution made by P has been modified or changed by its appearance within the scope of that intentional condition. And so what is the implicit thing in the right case? The topic of P is not the same as the topic of P than P. And what that means, moreover, is that the topic of P is not the same as the topic of this individual P, right? It's somehow been altered or modified. The contribution that this P makes to the overall topic is different from the contribution that this makes, right? So, what I'm going to say is that is essentially the rejection of intentional transparency for intentional connectors. That these aren't the same topics, even though it's the same atom that appears in there, it's been transformed. So you can line up some of these principles about transparency that the way that Franz articulates it. You can line these things up with large classes of relevant logics. there's some relevant, well, all relevant logics that I know of reject negation transparency. All of the depth relevant logics are the ones that reject sort of intentional transparency or intentional connected. So there's this really nice sort of coordination between these sort of more semantic, like informal principles that are discussed by Franz on one hand, and this highly formal hierarchy of relevant logics on the other. So what I want to introduce here is a novel kind of variable sharing that falls out from that conditional agnostic stuff. Because my intention is that depth relevance is great, but it loses, it's lossy in some sense. It loses some information about the fact that the position that an atom appears in, or the position of subformula appears in a conditional, whether it's on the left-hand side or the right-hand side, that makes a difference about its overall contribution. And if we look at the relevant, the containment logics that I talked about yesterday, we're going to see that there's a very interesting variable sharing property that falls out of it. And it turns out ultimately that there's a really nice class of relevant logics that exhibit it as well. Okay, so does make sense? Okay, so brief sort of overview of these variable sharing properties. First, just the vanilla variable sharing property. A logic enjoys the VSP if for every theorem of the form if P then C, where this is an intentional connected, there exists an atomic formula that's common to both of them. So this is your standard. This is the first thing that the relevant logicians sort of discovered holds with relevant logic, and it's sometimes taken as a criterion. Sean Standupper has been, or will be soon in print arguing that this is really like this is the characteristic. So relevant logics in general enjoy this variable sharing property. As I mentioned, this proscriptive principle, which you find with the parity case, is very, very similar, right? Every time I can prove an intentional conditional like this, every variable that appears in C already appears in the antecedent, right? We can't exceed the topic of the antecedent when we do a conceptual analysis. And Perry proves in his 1933 that his logic satisfies this prescriptive principle. So again, you can see how if everything in C appears in phi, and this is well formed, it has atoms in it. So if every variable that appears in C appears in phi, then that means that there has to be overlap. So containment is a special case of overlap. These things are in fact relevant logics in a very strong sense. And in some sense, they're even more relevant. They have a stricter requirement on how variables relate to each other than just stock relevant logics. So the topic theoretic view of this then is that what is really revealed when we think about the requirement that there be an atom in common. A very common thing that we see is Anderson and Belknap pointed this out, is they use this phrase of common content. There has to be common content to both the antecedent and consequence. And a lot of people, Humberstone and Ed Mears and Neil Tennant, have given this an explicitly sort of subject matter gloss. That what does it mean to have common content? Anderson and Belknap leave that very, very much opaque. There's common content, and then you can do with it what you want. I think received interpretation that we have that's almost was just very, very, very entrenched, is that what that means is that there is a common subject matter to both things. And that if you want to think about what it means for something to be relevant to another thing, common subject matter seems to be a pretty good interpretation of what that means. So the dominant view is that relevance strongly leads to topic overlap. Right, and as I've been trying to push, like in terms of containment logics, they have this sort of topic theoretic gloss already. The analysis means you never exceed past the topics that are included in the antecedent, because if I'm doing an honest to God analysis of a concept, I can't dip my hand outside of that concept. I can only use the things that I have. If you want to think about this in analogy with what I was getting across with the why is there a topic theoretic filter on imagination, and I'm going to keep this in mind when I go read Walton again, is that when I initiate an imaginative activity, I do so with a finite number of concepts, right? My imaginative activity is not just incomplete truth theoretically, but it seems to be incomplete on a topic theoretic level as well. I close my eyes and I imagine a city that I imagine Chicago. Like, I'm not imagining things about rocket ships. I'm not imagining things about anything. I'm thinking about buildings, I'm thinking about people, I'm thinking about streets. There's this palette, if you want to think about it through like a painting analogy. I have an imaginative episode, there's a certain palette from which I work, and I can't start dipping outside of that palette if I want to analyze the imaginative episode. The same thing goes, I think, for conceptual analysis. The concept is built from a finite stock of topics, and I'm never going to find an alien topic in that concept itself. I hope that wasn't too abstract. But these sort of things, I think, are the kinds of things that we think about that motivate these sort of containment logics. So in general, right, one thing about like, we can't just give relevant logics a necessary and sufficient condition through these sort of these topic overlap things, right? It's not ever sufficient to say, and then this is a nice thing about relevant logics generally, is you can't just say, well, look, any of the mainstream ones, you can't say, well, this is truth preserving, and also there's always topic overlap, and therefore this is going to be provable. But what we do find is that we have a lot of room to refine these variable sharing properties to more and more closely fit whatever that necessary and sufficient condition might be. We can get closer and closer by refining these variable sharing properties. And we go back here, you can view this little chart here as a set of refinements. And you can complete this, Shay completed this last year, 2 years ago, in this JPL paper where we've got strong depth relevance, where it needs to reject both negation transparency, and it has to reject both intentional transparency as well. It's not sufficient that a variable appears with the same sign. It's not sufficient that it appears in the same depth. On this additional refinement that's very recent, it has to appear with both the same depth and the same sign. So you have this nice hierarchy of things, but as far as I know, that strong variable sharing property is the strongest thing that had been introduced as of like a year. Okay. So yeah, we can, if we want if a relevant logic has a very refined variable sharing property, I want to think that that corresponds to an analogous refinement in the theory of how intentional topics work. That's sort of implicit at the core of that relevant logic. So if you tell me that the VSP is the only thing that's necessary, you have a much more permissive view about when topics overlap. I'm sorry for making people push. I'm going back and forth, and I know that whoever's doing that, it's difficult. I'm sorry. If you insist on something like strong depth relevance, your criterion for what constitutes topic overlap is now much more subtle. And that seems like what's going on is just saying no, like topics have a far more intricate theory of how these intentional contributions are made than we may have thought. So as we get more and more relevant objects that correspond to these stronger and stronger variable sharing properties, I think it's very natural to think of them as having corresponding theories of topic that are brought out in this way. Yes, so we talked about variable sharing, strong variable sharing. I mentioned this. The meaning of atomic formula, this sort of topic theoretic gloss. The meaning of a topic is sensitive to sign. It matters whether it appears as a positive or a negative variable. Right, so sign altering operations, in this case, like negation, non-trivially play a hand in the determination of the overall topic. So again, this sort of negation transparency just seems to correspond to strong variable sharing. We find this in another containment logic due to Angel. Right, and he proved that for any theorem that was provable in his system, every variable that appears positively in in B appears positively in A, and every variable that appears positively or negatively in B appears negatively in A. So we're already contexts, namely a C, which has had a pretty tremendous resurgence of interest as well, in which this sort of thing is already implicit as well. Right, so a variable appears negatively, it's in the scope of non-number negation signs. In this case, positively, it's not. So if we want to go ahead and determine sign recursively, right, we kind of preserve it when we get to a negation sign, the subformula, if B appears positively in A, we toggle the sign when we're nested in a negation. We toggle the sign when we're in the left-hand side of an implication or a condition. Yeah, and the Erkenntnis paper and the Erkenntnis paper makes a big deal about this. I do want to say, and this comes in some sense back to intuitionist negation, that the way in which topics are modified by negation versus being in the left-hand side might differ. And I want to remain agnostic about that. So notably, right, if we have, like, if you think about, like, not A as equivalent to, like, if A then falsum, like both of these toggle signs, if negation isn't intuitionistic, it might, the sign might affect the overall subject matter in a slightly different way, right? And I wanted to go ahead and think that, like, this just purely, if this is a non-intuitionistic negation, that it just purely, when you just say not, that it sort of updates the overall topic of the subformula in a sort of pure fashion. And this one does so through like changing the position in the conditional. There's a lot to be said about this, but I just want to, at this point, I want to say that it's not obvious that these are always the same modifications, right, to the contribution. But they may be. If I'm an intuitionist, of course, if I'm an intuitionist, I'd say, of course, these are the same. But if I'm in a system that has both like a classical negation or like a constructible falsity negation and an intuitionistic negation, I also want to say, look, what does this do if I'm in like a Nelson system? And this is a strong negation. This says, I'm no longer talking about proofs, I'm talking about refutations. It like literally toggles the meaning of this, the subject matter in a very different way. Whereas if I'm in that system and I'm talking about the relationship between the topic of A and the topic of intuitionistic not, I'm still talking about proofs. So I want to just leave room for these things to differ at the end of the day. Does that make sense? Right? In the Nelson style thing, the difference is that the topic of A is about proofs, talking about not A is about refutations. The difference in the intuitionist case is that they're both still about proofs. Okay. So when we just record the sign of something, we don't necessarily always have a lot of information about how that sign was taught. But it's an important thing that we, at the end of the day, want to not lose. So strong variable sharing corresponds, I think, very heavily to the rejection of negation transparency. Negation transparency, as I defined it, the negation does not transform subject matter. And I acknowledged yesterday, and I'm acknowledging again, that there are some challenges to this, although, as it was pointed out, I'm not necessarily sharp enough to articulate those at this point. Okay, Brady's depth relevance. Again, A and B have to share a variable of the same depth. The depth of an occurrence in the subformula is the degree of nestings of these intentional operators, intentional conditionals required to reach that occurrence. And again, I want to say it's the rejection of topic transparency of intentional operators in containment logics. Same kind of thing. So, yeah. So what I think this shows is that relevant logics have a number of different ways of denying just blanket topic transparency. They can have disagreements. Like R might have a different theory about whether we should reject negation transparency, but we can keep transparency of intentional conditionals. Brady says no. We need to maintain. We only really need to think about the transparency of intentional conditionals. We can assume transparency for negation at the bottom state. So, like each of these relevant logics comes back with its own sort of set of answers to these questions. Yeah, so intentional operators, I think, very obviously don't. So what I wanted to, where this comes from, what I'm going to say comes from is by looking at when I define this conditional agnostic system, it's a subsystem of various logic, so it clearly has this prescriptive principle. But I wanted to know, like, can we get any more refined version of the prescriptive? So that was kind of the first challenge about how to look at these things quite relevant objects. And the way of proving that there is one and defining it, I'm going to define it in two ways. Is first, we assume like negation transparency in that system. Again, if I'm philosophically, if I'm problematic, in that system, you can kind of safely assume that. Well, the method of doing this, and I started introducing this at the New Directions workshop, New Directions and Relevant workshop, which was an awesome event. The way I started doing this was building up what I thought it was an armature, right? So if I want to know in any given situation, I've got a sentence, if P, then Q, like this. If I want to know what the contribution that R in this this Q in this context makes, the way that I would want to go do it is I would want to look at the overall sort of skeletal structure of its appearance. I would say first, well, Q appears, well, for one, the topic of this is an essential conjunction. So I want to see what the contribution that Q makes in a complex. Well, I know it's just going to be the fusion with this. So I can safely just look at one side because that's an extensional conjunction. But then I want to say, okay, well, Q's contribution to this first is mediated by its appearance in this intentional connective. So now what I want to do is I'm going to say it appears on, like, part of what its contribution is going to appear on the right side. And then when I look at the subformula, well, part of its contribution is that it appears on the left side. So the way of getting at this initially was trying to build up a structure that respects the chirality, whether it appears on the left-hand side or not. It obliterates the contributions of negation and extensional connectives, but we're able to recover just in this very schematic way all of the atoms that appear in that sentence and the sort of positional information that so I called that an armature, and it forms sort of the skeleton from which you're able to just get the minimal trace needed to figure out what that overall subject matter contribution was. Yeah, so it's sort of minimal armature. I mean, this is like kind of like an armature, if you're building like a model, is like the wire skeleton that you build like a puppet, right? So it's like the bare sort of bones thing that you need to recover all that information. Okay, so to illustrate how we get the armature of something, right? The armature of this sentence is going to, I've got a relatively complex sentence here, P and Q, so I'm not going to read it in that. You see the sentence right here. There's an armature right here. We can start digging it out pretty easily. I've got a P and a not R. The topic of R is just not R, the same as R. So how do I package this up? I package this up all the atoms that appear on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side in an ordered pair. Okay, how do I keep on unpacking this? Well, okay, I've got Q or R, and I know that this is extensional, so the only thing I need to know for right here is that it has Q and it has R in it. That's how I packet these things up. Now I've got this overarching conditional right here. So what do I need to know? I need to know that the packet right here is on the left-hand side. It's this unordered pair QR. The packet here, which is this ordered tuple, this appears on the right-hand side. So now I can recover that. Then I've got this conjunction with P. It's redundant with additional things. So now I just pack that in. So I think that this is how I do this in the New Directions paper. Shay isn't pushing on. Essentially, what I'm doing here is just going through the parse tree. And you can make another nice motor presentation of this through that, and you're going to look at it. But the idea here is that this doesn't, you can't recover the semantics or the truth conditions of this by just looking at this packet. But we can say for anything in here, I know about like the topic and how it was modified by its appearance in the conditional condition. This appearance of Q, what do I need to know? Well, it's part of here, it's on the right-hand side, and then it's on the left-hand side. Those are the series of operations that modified its subject matter, and that's how it contributed to the whole. Is it something about P? something about P's appearance in the left-hand side and the way that that appearance would operate had been modified by the appearing in the right-hand side of the condition. Okay, so that path that the atom sort of carves through left and right sides of conditionals, it provides sort of a genealogy, right? Like a kind of family tree in the sense of, or provenance of how those conditionals have influenced its contribution to the complex, right? So this is a piece of information about subject matter and how it was modified. And we can put this in a very nice way. And this is more due to when I started working with Shay on this. So this is a version when he did the strong depth relevant. This is related to his work on strong depth relevance. But what we can start doing is we can start recursively defining one of these genealogies as a string of left symbols L, L, and R. Right? And this string is going to give us all the information we need for any given atom to say, this is how its subject matter was modified in the conditional agnostic case. Right? So how does this work? If P is just C, then the contribution it makes to itself is just the empty string. Right? So what is the contribution that P makes to P? Well, it's just itself. Its topic is already assigned out of P. And in the case of negation and these essential connectives, we just again say that it's not modified at all. It doesn't do anything. But when we come to being in the left or right hand side, then to get that genealogy, if it appears on the left hand side, we pop an L on that string, that provenance. And if it appears on the right hand side, then the whole we pop on the right. Right, so the provenance, like a provenance of a piece of art, if you don't know the term, is right, like your list of where that piece of art has been. Right, it tells you who you bought it from, who that person bought it from, where they discovered it, who it was stolen from. Like the provenance is the origin from. It gives you that origin story from the place of its creation to your hands. And so essentially, we have a provenance of the subject matter contribution that any atom makes through this step. So to give you an example of this, we have a formula P and Q, then it's not the case that if R then T, and if this holds, then T holds. So we can kind of look at certain things in here. The way that P, in instance of P appears in here is what's the contribution of P in this? Well, it's going into the left, into this formula, it goes into the left then. What is the contribution of Q? Same thing, I go into the left of the whole, and then it was modified by appearing in the left again. What is the contribution of R? Well, it was in the left, and then it was modified by its appearance in the right-hand side of the condition. Okay, so now we can talk about new variable string properties. So we'll say that a formula is genealogically included in a formula Phi if every occurrence of atomic formulas appearing in C occur in Phi with that same genealogy. So what that means is that it doesn't suffice to say that every atom appearing in Phi occurs in Phi, every atom appearing in Psi occurs in Phi. What is now required is saying that the contribution that each of those atoms makes to Phi, or to Psi, is exactly the same as the contribution that it makes in Phi. It's gone through the same set of transformations. And then we can introduce then a genealogical prescriptive principle. So we can now say that for every theorem of the form if Phi then Psi is genealogically included. Right? So this is a much stronger thing than we have in the standard cases. It takes into account, Ross Brady just says, listen, we want to reject, he doesn't say this explicitly, but implicit in the framework is that we don't need to just reject all of them. We reject intentional transparency for conditionals, but we don't care about what side of the conditional they appear. All we need to know is that it appears with a C. It's just any conditional. This is the thing that we need, so it refines Brady's case, because now we think about whether you appear in the left or right hand side also makes a difference. So theorem, anything that's provable in the system that we talked about yesterday, that armature in C is a subset of that armature. Those armatures, if you recall, those are sets. So literally you have an inclusion of the armature of the consequent in the armature of the antecedent. Set theoretic. We can have a lemma that the armature inclusion, so theoretically, is the same as the genealogical inclusion, and that gives us a corollary that this novel variable sharing property or novel prescriptive principle is satisfied by the system that was introduced. I think that's kind of cool. Okay, so the prescriptive principle formulation, this can be used to provide a proper variable sharing criterion. Let's check my time again.
11 minutes.
Okay. I think I might go a little bit before. Okay, which is good. It's a break. All right. Every prescriptive principle has a corresponding variable sharing property. Because we're not talking about inclusion, but we talk about overlap. Right? So if I have this genealogical prescriptive principle, this induces another version of a relevance criterion that is a genealogical sort of variable sharing property. So we define these provenances right here. We can say that a logic has a genealogical GSP, and for every theorem, there are instances of some formulas such that they have that same genealogy, right? So this is not inclusion, but this is overlap. So intuitively, this is sort of natural transition from like looking at depth relevance, because chirality, and we looked at a number of cases yesterday where remember order invariance, like I think it's very clear that like if that phi, if P then C can have a different topic than if C then P. The order matters. It's not just that they appear nested, it matters sometimes what that configuration is like. So this is, I think, a natural sort of generalization of the Brady kind of stuff. Strong depth relevance tells us both depth and polarity are important. Genealogical relevance tells us depth and polarity in the sense of where you appear, the left or right hand side. Both of these follow from a prior criterion. They have the right structure. That the contribution that they're making has been modified by intentional connectives in precisely the right ways. Okay, so question that I will give you an answer to, but are there any genealogically relevant logics? And of course, in one sense, we just proved that it is. If it has a genealogical prescriptive principle, it has a genealogical BSP. But the parity thing is like kind of a black sheep, right? It's not of any importance to the mainstream relevant logician that I can cook up a parity style logic that has this more novel and nuanced variable sharing property. The question is, and it's not trivial, is can we find anything in the Australasian tradition that satisfies this? And Shay and I and Sean are working on stuff where you can prove that this holds. This property is exhibited by the relevant logic B. So the basic relevant logic has this genealogical variable sharing property. It has even stronger ones, and there's even stronger properties can be found for something like BN. But the question that I had like several months ago was, are there any mainstream ones? And yes, there are. Okay, so one thing that is also interesting. So what we've done is we've created this provenance. And again, I told you, listen, we're not going to really think about variable sharing. Actually, we're not going to really think about negation transparency in this case. We're going to we're working in the parity setting, and we're just going to leave that alone. But suppose instead of just recording the L's and the R's, I also wanted to concern myself with the instances of negation. If I wanted to have something that was fully lossless, if I wanted that intentional provenance to be entirely informative about all the transformations that occurred, I would want to not only crawl through and look at whether it appeared on the left and the right hand side of a conditional, I also want to see about when those ends came into play. Right? So that seems to be like all of the intentional transformative operations that conditionals and negations have put on would be recovered by a string of L's and R's and N's. So oh yeah, another thing is that we can view. Yeah. So one of the things that's nice is that looking at things in this way, we have a fully like informative trace of all of the conditional and negation influence over the overall subject matter that we have by just recording the appearances of left, right, and ends. And we can view all of the variable sharing properties that I have found in the literature through this lens on this vocabulary. So we can think, in some sense, that what is the topic of in Ross Brady's system, the topic of if P then Q is going to be identical to the topic of if Q then P. The only thing that's important is that P has appeared in a conditional. So we can think of this as an equivalence relation on the sort of that problem. And what does that mean is that I treat two things as equivalent whenever L or R appear. Right? So the trace of P in this formula is L, the trace of P in this formula is R. If I say all topics are equivalent whenever that like I can just exchange L's and R's, then I can define like the depth relevance condition on equivalence between contributions through an equivalence relation on strings of L's, R's, and N's. Right? I can view the variable sharing property itself as just any one of these strings, sigma and tau, all of these are equivalent. I don't care about the L's, I don't care about the R's or the N's. All I care about is whether atom appears in both places. So I can start thinking about if I have this space of all of these traces of L's and R's and N's, these strings, they give me the combined history for a variable about how its topic was influenced. Now we can start looking at how all other variable sharing properties break up. So yeah, we can recast a number of these things. For example, if I just start thinking about strings where I add n when something appears in negation or on the left-hand side. So if we wanted to assign these provenances with this v, or this nu, I'm sorry, then strong variable sharing can be talked about as like a similarity between these strings of nus, these new strings, right? So just strings of n's. If I want to talk about depth relevance, instead of the L's and the R's, I can start just popping C's in there. In the same way that I have the equivalence relation that says all L's and R's are the same. And we can again say strong depth relevance is just that they have appeared in just the same sequences of C's. The lossless C unrelevance that's in Shea in my paper, right? We can do this with C's and N's. So we have like a very uniform thing. And we have the strongest possible one, which I think is very nice. Yeah, so Shea and my, one of the results in that paper is if we just restrict ourselves to topic transparency for conditionals without thinking about the order, the position, and negations, that BM has this super strong property that a string of conditionals and negations has to be identical. Now, here's a sort of limiting case right here. So all of these all of these variable sharing criteria can be viewed as equivalence relations on the space of the Kleene closure of this vocabulary, the Kleene star of the set LRN. If we were absolutely lossless about that, where every instance of a negation is recorded, every instance of appearing in the left-hand side is recorded with an L, every appearance of being in the scope of the right-hand side is with an R. This is all of the information that I can think of about how intentional connectors and negation have altered the overall subject matter of the part. So this is, on this line, the absolutely strongest variable sharing property when you take into account the intentional contributions of intentional operators over the subject matter of them. And this is the new thing that we've got. BM, again, exhibits the strongest possible variable sharing property that there is, that we can possibly articulate in this setting. It doesn't suffice that they appear with the same polarity or the same sign. It doesn't suffice that they're in the same nesting of conditionals. It doesn't suffice that they have the same sequence of L's and R's. The history on both sides has to be completely identical. So that is the most fine-grained sort of theory of intentional subject matter that you can cook up in this kind of setting. And lo and behold, BM, just below B, the relevant logic, has just the maximal sort of variable sharing property. So I'm going to leave you with this. And this is not a review, but it's, I think, very nice. If we wanted to talk about equivalence relations on these strings, all of these variable terrain properties that we have in the literature correspond to an equivalence relation. There are these things correspond to these variable terrain properties. I have an AJL paper where the number, the modulus, if I have like the topic of P is going to be equal to the topic of not P in some systems, like the modulus of negation is going to come into play, this modulus N, and the number of negations is going to be the most important thing. So these AJL variable string properties correspond to certain equivalence classes. My stock BSP is just that any of these strings, well, they're all equivalent. It's the closest possible one. That's what I meant when I said, like, I don't care if it's an L or an R or an N, it doesn't matter. All that matters is its appearance. This is the closest possible equivalence relation. Everything is equivalent. You can introduce one for depth relevance, for the strong variable string property, for strong depth relevance, all equivalence relations on these genealogies. Shay and my CN relevance, the genealogical one that I just showed with PA, CAPAI, so your CAPAI. And then what Shay and Sean and I are doing right now, Laricone relevance, and this absolutely lossless one that holds through BM. So we have this very nice spectrum of equivalence classes that we can put on these genealogies. Every single thing that you find in the literature corresponds to one of these. And it's a very nice thing on the total, the top of this, we've got all our relevance logics, and then on the bottom, the most fine-grained equivalence class that again corresponds to a very natural relevant logic, namely BM. So that is the state of the art so far as I have it. I tried to show that there's some, what we talked about yesterday, there's some applications to the Franz Faraday style stuff, and I tried to show that there's a lot of relevance to the mainstream relevant logics, that this helps us get a better handle on the implicit theories of subject matter and intentional subject matter that you have in relevant logics. I think this is a very nice little chart. And that's what I have to say, so thank you very much.
So that's the time for questions, comments. Raise your hand. Oh, yes. Thank you.
Thomas, I want to ask you how works the genealogical relevance for meta inference or meta arguments.
This is related in many ways to the question about that came up with the discussion about sequence calculi yesterday.
Yes.
So, and I think my answers would probably be similar. So, look, like one of the things that I don't believe a whole lot, but I do have this lingering suspicion that if you to go and defend a logic on the basis of a philosophical principle, you're saying like, listen, the metaphysics are such and such, or language is so and so, right? No, the nature of human knowledge is in this way, and therefore we should adopt this logic. That if you were being honest about being motivated by about principles of reasoning, then it's dishonest to say, but my meta theory is classical. I find something very suspect about that. And I know, like, and Dave has, like, one step is enough. Like, I know that there are rejoinders to that, but I always find it very suspect. If you really, honest to God, believe in what you're saying, then you need to, this is not just a toy logic, but this is a good, adequate representation of how reasoning patterns ought to work. That you need to have the courage of your convictions. You need to say my meta theory should operate the same. Understand it's not a perfect world. It's very difficult to do relevant meta theory. It's difficult to do, when you try and do everything intuitionistly in meta theory, there's a lot of really attractive things that you lose. I understand that this is not always achievable, but it's something to strive for. And so when we think about meta inferences, and this is again with like, I think sequence calculate, I don't have the language. I have to be a little imprecise here, but I want the shape of my meta inferences in general to reflect the shape of those turnstiles. I want them to obey something that I at least have a family resemblance so that I can say, yeah, there's a common thread here. I'm not being disharmonious. And so I think that if we wanted to think about these things through kind of inferences, the difficulty there is, again, I mentioned Cornelio and Corbalon. Cornelio and Corbalon's sequence calculi for the Halden and Beauclair nonsense systems, and about how they have these sort of grotesque syntactic requirements. You can draw this inference with this proviso that the atomic variables appear in the right way. And I think that those are gross. I would imagine, again, in a case like this, if you wanted these sorts of things to appear correctly in the meta-inferential sense, that you would need to have better technology to avoid having to go into those sort of weird moves. And I imagine, again, that what Francesco Paoli's done with those might have some lessons for us. But yeah, I mean, another thing that I don't know if I'm tracking entirely with what you were saying. Another way that I might have responded on another understanding is that I would like to know what the subject matter of a meta inference is. And there's something very interesting there, and maybe there is a little disharmony. Because when we think about meta inferences, we think schematically. We're arranging those like meta variables over all sentences, and so it's not clear what the subject matter is going to be. But yeah, I think I interpreted what you said in two different ways. One is like, how can we execute the meta inferential stuff in order to get us this kind of logic? Yes. And then there's a subordinate question of how do we assign subject matters to meta inferences. Both those are intimately related, and I think, again, looking to what Paoli's done, and also some just like deep, hard thinking about it would be in order. So, yeah. Did I actually answer your question? Yes. Okay. Thank you.
I have sort of a more epistemological question.
Okay.
What if I only assign the same term to two different, the same term in the formula, but there in reality is a different topic to say.
So,
we can have all the sharing properties.
things like homographs or something?
Yeah.
Like a let's get a holograph. Yeah, I think that all of the problems there are just going to be the same kind of problems that you would be met with just in even classical logic, thinking about the truth conditions.
Yeah.
Because it's just it's a function of the formalization of languages.
Yeah.
That we might get ourselves into these sorts of troubles. And if we're doing things formally, we don't have those pragmatic rules of natural language that we use. When you say something that's weird because you've used the same term in two different senses, what happens to me is that I think, wait, what? And then I think about what you meant, and I kind of try and work it out, and I take the most plausible. And that's not built into doing things like in a formal logic. So I would imagine that, yeah, that's a thing that happens, and we do introduce new, like, different distinct topics with something when it's like a homophone. But I don't know if it's a problem for just topic. I think the problem would already be there because we need to know the truth conditions, and we have one term referring to two different propositions. Yeah, but it's something to think about. Thank you.
Thanks. Please. Yeah. Thank you. This was awesome. Yeah, I can think of this as part of a larger project showing that containment logics belong to this larger family of associative logics. I can see that as merely saying that, oh, look, containment logics, connected logics, relevant logics, all they belong to this family concerned with doing right with implications. And I can see that as part of the argument saying, look, there is more than family resemblance. There is this kind of principles that show them why they hang together.
Can you remind me of the definition of associativity again? Is there like, like one line for that?
And taking care of the link between the antecedent and consequence.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, up to that, I'm fine. I would like to hear more about your argument. Say that containment logics, or at least Paris logics, are relevant logics, because I think that satisfying this version of or any this particularly strong version of the variable sharing principle wouldn't be enough. Because Richard and Val have a particular story about relevance, and that's why they rejected our systems. That's one request, at least more about your argument to say that Paris logics belong to the relevance logics. If there is any, in addition, to say that they satisfy this kind of principles. And second thing is, some years ago, you remember, we were trying to make this kind of argument, say, look, there is something in connected logics that make them belong to the associative family, and let's look for these syntactic principles that might be in play in connected logics. And variable sharing principle is not enough. And at some point we played with the no-lose pieces properties. There are other properties that one should take into account. And yeah, maybe two requests here. Have you thought of these other stricter principles? And any ideas about how to do this for at least some connected logics?
Okay, so first things, whether Perry-style stuff is relevant in the important sense. If it's not just the letter of the law of the spirit, I think that Silva makes good arguments that it's not coming out of the model theory or the representation of how life situations work. It's something that's being tacked on after the fact in some sense. I think he's a little bit too vicious, and I think maybe unfair, but I think the kernel of what he's saying is true. This isn't coming out semantically. There's an auxiliary device. So I don't want to necessarily defend that Perry was always a relevant model. It's a really relevant logic.
Mm-hmm.
But part of the point of the latter half of this was that even if it's not, there's still a lot of insights that we can make. And I think that diagram right there, I think that is a very insightful diagram. It's also a beautiful diagram. That's Yuka's ticks right there. I should give her credit for that beautiful diagram. So I didn't want to defend Perry logics as relevant. I wanted to defend that there's something that we can learn from that they're informal. And I think that there is. I do have a suspicion, and I've off and on thought about this, that you can do the Perry-style stuff by having a sense of a notion of something being nonsensical in situations in the ternary relation semantics, and by having you make not accessibility relation, but you have this partial ordering over worlds, that you have some things if something is meaningful here, it must be meaningful there, at least over non-normal worlds. So I think that there are natural ways to get containment by asserting that some sentences just don't make sense at some situations in the standard term relations metrics. But I haven't developed that all the way. But I get what you're saying. Someone's got some reasonable points to be made, and I wouldn't want to say it's associative in necessarily that sense. On the second point about, I think maybe the second question-ish thing was
about structural principles, not exactly the variable sharing principle, but the no-use pieces.
No, yeah.
Kind of stuff.
The last thing in my paper, the last like paragraph was on no-use pieces. Maybe you're the person that suggested that. But yeah, that is. Oh, what was it? The thing that we concluded with. This was one of those nice things. Is I have been. Thinking about how. I've been thinking about sentences of this form, and about why there might not be relevance between them. And then the referee was like, "Oh, have you looked at the no loose pieces principle?" And the same stuff that had given me pause, and I had to pull up the paper, were the same things that are the no loose pieces. So I didn't know the term no loose pieces principle, but I had already been on those same formulas. So I think that there is a story to tell about that. It was just, that was one of those after the fact things. It was like that for future research. But yeah, I think there's this sort of thinking about no loose pieces from a topic theoretic perspective, I think is a very, very fruitful option. I have a lot of emotion. Now, one thing I should also point out is that I'm not in any way saying that any of these things should ever be sufficient. Right? Variable strength should never be sufficient. This is always, like, if you want to be associative, this has to be a symptom. This has to be something that's exhibited as a end result of associativity rather than like the cause. So I don't want to say that variable strength properties should drive the projects, but they reveal something, like symptoms do. A symptom of a disease reveals something about the disease. The fact that a logic, the fact that DK minus exhibits the strong depth relevance property. The fact that B exhibits this, the fact that you go down to DM exhibits this. Those are symptoms of the underlying apparatus that reveal some of the subject matter assumptions that are being made by that logic. So if I suggested that these are enough to get you something to relevance itself or to associativity itself, this has nothing to do with truth conditions. Right? And there has to be something about truth also that gets you accountants. So these alone are never going to be enough, but they're suggestive enough, I think, to teach us something about what's going on in the inner machinery of these relevant measures. Did I answer your question? I don't know how to get to this is not a path to get associated.
I think it is to associative, it is, but not relevance. But we can discuss about this. Okay. But some thoughts about applying this to connectivity.
I mean, I've been talking to you about connected logic for a decade. I really want the thing that connected logic is like defensible, and look at the Ramsey test, like really cool, but it's about something different than logic. It's about a different set of cases, and you think about like Aristotle and you're making the remarks about something's largeness cannot entail its non-largeness or something. Like, it seems to me that like you're speaking too quickly sometimes. And like, I think it's a very attractive thing that there's a connection about here's my worry about connected logic in general, and I think that it applies in these cases. I think about this as reasoning about the activities, right? If we think about like proposition space, right? We've got all of these propositions, and we've got this huge lattice. We've got like top up here, we've got bottom up here, and we've got this whole space of all of these like meanings out here. And they form this huge lattice, right? And how many are there? There's like, you know, like Beth 1 over here. And how many things do we have in activities? We've got 2. If I were to reason about the entailment relations between any of these uncountably many propositions, there's a whole bunch of principles that I can use, and those are connected. Nothing entails its own negation. Fine. The problem is that I take all of my experience with the standard day-to-day principles that I use, right? The coffee is running low, right? I'm holding a blue pen. I'm wearing shoes. All of the entailment relations I start using as a guide to life. I start thinking, well, they apply all the way over here. Let me go and they clearly must hold at the activities as well. Then I find out they don't. But I think that like the analogy that I have used in these cases is my saying that I can encounter there are of all the reals, almost all of them, for almost all J, 1 over J is well defined, right? That doesn't justify me in saying that for all J, 1 over J is well defined, because 1 over 0 is not well. And so the analogy I think right there is that we would never say that almost all numbers are such you can divide a number by them. And therefore this one lingering weird corner case 0, like we should draw the conclusion. The same reasons, the fact that almost all propositions are connexity in the sense that they don't entail their own negation doesn't justify us in saying in these 2 finite cases, like we should be able to reason like those in the same way. So like my internal story about connexive logic, and this is dated because it's not really taking into account a lot of things that Heinrich just said, is that the allure right there is that co-finitely many cases, and in fact, I never reason about top and bottom in my day-to-day life, right? Almost everything I ever encounter, we can reason about connexively as like a very good guy, and will never get me into trouble. But these guys at the top and the bottom are just so weird. I don't know if that has related to BFPs.
Yeah. Yes. Because I disagree with this. So
we should disagree with each other.
Yeah. But I think that's besides the point right now, because my interest is purely formal. Suppose that connexive logic is such that it in fact applies to the string cases as well, as many people want them to do. And some people think that they belong to the associative family as well, with relevance logics and containment logics, and there are reasons to believe so, because you yourself used this P implies not as symptom of something bad, well, in this implication, right? That's the idea in at least part of connexive logic as well. So we played, as I say, with this tracking literals and tracking the number of occurrences of literals and so on. And yeah, in some cases they resemble it too much, so to speak, already known principles, syntactic principles in relevance logic.
All right, so here's something, an idea.
Yeah.
I would worry that if I wanted to try and recast this in connexive logics in this sort of setting where I've got all of these different provenances that are the like tell me exactly what the meaning of an atom is, and therefore like its contribution to a complex. And I want to have something like phi never implies not phi, because the meaning's never over. What I would worry is that would require some kind of function over that space, that tiny closure of the L's, the N's, and the R's, such that corresponds to like n, such that you never have any fixed points.
Mhm.
And I would worry that, I mean, it's still very undeveloped. This just came to me, so fun. And I would worry that whenever I hear something that would require no fixed points, like there's fixed points all the time, right? So I would worry that, because it seems to be where you're going, like you want to have like, there's nothing in common between V and not V.
Still, that would be an answer would be okay. Connectivity leads to contradictions. Requires non-fixed points, but there will be fixed points. That would be an argument for Heinrich style connective logics, but still.
I mean, one thing that you're going to be committed to is that the extensional connectives are topic theoretically transformative, because you need to have P and not P be a different meaning than than P or not P.
Yeah.
So you're going to probably, if you wanted to try to jack it through like this kind of topic theoretic approach, you would need to say, and that's, it feels kind of implicit with what Graham's connected logic is. This is like the negations cancellation thing. It's like the topic theoretic, the way that conjunction determines the overall topic is such that it obliterates the overall topic in these cases. So you have to have conjunction play the topic transformative role. Or else you're going to get like P and not P implies not P. So yeah, I think that like that might be a path, is like it's like conjunction somehow have these functions assigned with them over the space of topics, so that there are cases in which that function corresponds to a conjunction. Like I think I could see how this might work. Yeah, it would be, yeah, I think it's kind of plausible. It's tough. Yeah, it is. we chose it's a tough area. Yeah, connects logics. Thank you.
Okay, more questions? Disagreements? Disagreements, okay. Agreements as well.
Okay. I have a question related to previous one, and so
Yeah.
But what about the effective use improved principle? Okay, on variable sharing property is fine, the relevance is fine, but effective use improved is I think that is necessary for guarantee relevance.
Yeah, I mean, I admit I think in like the two papers on this, like I think there's like a footnote, like this isn't the only, like there's also like the use criterion. And then I just totally forget it. Well, because I mean, look, I mean, think about the journey. I've been like, for a year, I was just working on topic theoretic stuff. I want to see how it applies to relevant logics. Like that's going to be my natural, I'm going to get natural myopia, right? Everything I've got to end, right? And that doesn't look like a nail to me, so I'm going to leave it alone. But there's a cool paper that we just accepted at the AJL by a student of Shay's that is using like Artemis style justification logic in order to look at logics that have these weaker variable sharing properties. In particular, the C and like this guy right here that Shay and I just introduced. And it looks like you can give this sort of implicit proof theoretic account of why things that are not equivalent up to this might behave differently in a proof theoretic context. So that doesn't directly latch onto that. But look, I mean, I guess I'd say the other, I'd also go ahead and say that I think that this is assuming that we can go down to these weak relevant logics. And the moment you start going down past like T, like you already start having some issues with justifying or maintaining the use criteria, right? And so in some sense, it feels like when you start going low enough, we already mean something different when we talk about relevance. I don't know if anybody has really tried to like, for like DJ or something like to give it an account, like a use criterion interpretation. But I would imagine that if somebody is trying to follow Anderson and Belknap for weaker relevant logics, and I'm sure somebody has tried, that would be something that would be very interesting to see how that relates to the topic overlap reading. So I'm sorry, to answer the question, I don't know, I like, my command of the literature is not strong enough to know, like, somebody has probably worked on something about use criterion for weak relevant logics. I imagine that there's probably something to be said by reading that paper and looking at it, but I haven't. I don't know what paper that is, and I haven't unfortunately therefore read it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That's very, very important to think about. So thanks for bringing it up.
More questions?
Thank you all very much for having me again.
Thank you.